Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Good evening. My name is Faith Kazmi. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Interim Assistant Vice Provost for Inclusion and Community, overseeing the Centers for Equity, Community, and Leadership. And I'm also currently the Associate Dean and Director of the Women's Community Center here on campus. And it is, yay, thank you. It is so nice to see all of you here today. I want to first, you're going to be welcomed many times over, but I want to be the first to welcome you to this wonderful event called Changemakers. You're going to hear a little bit about the history and what this meeting represents, or what this event represents. But I thought I would just start by grounding ourselves in this space. I want to thank you for choosing to spend your time with us today and being here in community. We're about to hear from some incredible alumni, and I would just love everyone to just close your eyes and take a deep breath in and out, and release anything that you'd like to release so that you can be present here in this moment with the community that we have today. Thank you so much. I know there's a lot going on, and I'm really glad to have you all here. I also wanted to bring your attention to the beautiful cards on your seats to recognize the land that we're on. Thank you so much to our coordinators for organizing this. I also want to take a quick moment. I know that there's going to be gratitude mentioned later on, but this event would not be possible without Joaquin Garcia Peraza, who's our program coordinator for this program. So please join me in thanking Joaquin for all their hard work, and Joaquin will also be sharing additional gratitude later for the rest of the team that we have today. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you our first student speaker who's going to be helping carry the night with us, Viv. If you want to come on up and introduce yourselves, please join me in welcoming Viv to the podium.
Hello, everyone. Okay, I'll fix this a little bit. Thank you all for joining us for this year's Changemakers series. This event is hosted by the Centers for Equity, Community, and Leadership and consists of the Asian American Activity Center, Black Community Services Center, El Centro Chicano y Latino, First Generation and or Low Income Students Success Center, Native American Cultural Center, Marquez Resource Center, Queer Student Resources, and the Women's Community Center. My name is Vivian Huynh, and I'm a part of Stanford's class of 2024. I'm one of the Changemaker event coordinators for the ECL, and I'm also a program coordinator for the First Generation and or Low Income Student Success Center. I'd like to express my gratitude for the Fly SSC Associate Dean and Director, Simone Morales, the Assistant Dean and Associate Director, Jennifer Rowland, the Opportunity Fund Manager, Marcel Height, and the Assistant Director, Carolina Reyes, for upholding the pillars of advocacy, mentorship, community, and belonging for our center, and for also providing support and connections to resources for first generation and or low-income undergraduate students, graduate students, Fly transfer students, and former and current foster youth. Thank you for making an impact and for creating space for Fly students. So what exactly is Changemakers? Changemakers is made possible by the Yvette Lee Bowser, class of 1987, and her fund donated to us. The Changemaker series brings together people that are truly dedicated to serving their communities and enacting change for so many people, proving that change can happen at any moment in so many ways. Last year's Changemakers event featured panelists Michael Tubbs, Nicole Sandoval, and Gina McGuire. This year, we invited 3 more powerful Stanford alums to be a part of this event. Bacardi Jackson, Stefanie Tsosie, Angel Fabian were nominated to be panelists because they exemplify love for the community and they powerfully and confidently move and spark change. We are proud and excited to have them here with us today. And now I'd like to invite Alexandra Huynh, class of 2025, the 2021 National Youth Poet Laureate. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. Is it okay if I take this mic off the stage? Thanks for having me today. I feel incredibly lucky to be among the company of such amazing guests, panelists. I was lucky enough to be able to chat with Stefanie for a little bit during our dinner, and I'm really grateful that as a Stanford student, I'm a part of a lineage of changemakers and people who are advocating for better homes for their loved ones, both their ancestors and the ones who will come after them. And recently I've been thinking a lot about how we can look to the land as a place to see our responsibility to each other. And yeah, that's what this poem is going to be about. It does not matter any longer where you live, from news reports on the fires in California and the floods in Vietnam. 1, they waited for the answers they didn't want to hear but knew were reality. From my living room, I watch as tiny yellow men march into the worst darkness and pretend not to hear when they have names. Witness an unprecedented use of the word unprecedented. The state of California has swallowed Connecticut like fever, leaving behind a scorched footprint the shape of neglect. There are streetlights in the forest now. The forest is a city with wildfire for veins and a steady churn of smog. Vehicles spill onto highways to escape the color of death, but even the lucky ones wake up to smudged sun and sepia. Classic Western. Villainize nature, defend your honor, reduce the brown people to accessory. This is the work of a century's suppression, of a creature that feeds on its own dead. When there is nothing left to breathe, you produce the opposite of oxygen. Don't need a crystal ball. Return the trees to their cradles. Burn the land clean of history. Seethe warning, blaze insurrection. Do not slow, do not slow. Let them see the inferno they created. 2, local residents now live in a way that is prepared for natural disaster. In the country my mother loves, in its naked heart, coastlines unravel into starving hands, drawing anything with mass into wet embrace. Include the slippers, whose tattered pockets kept our feet from catching wind, and the plastic collected to prove we exist. Include the caution tape, the bamboo, the dining tables, the books, the altars, the rice, the fields they grow in, the aoyai, the photos, and the children who have now found mothers in this soft earth. They say it sounds like a bomb when the mountain that is not actually a mountain explodes, and it weeps burials for the willowed bodies who watch water rise to fool their conscience, who recite Buddha's name until synonymous with mosquito hum, who hold real hands in the dark of electricity while millions of hummingbirds crash into sheet metal roof and herds of baby elephants swarm at the ankles which, of course, the meteorologists will call rainfall and the parents will call temporary, call home. 3, their only desire was to be together in the home they loved. The structures are empty now, either because the people fled or endured baptism by flame, flood. An elderly couple is found in the charcoal of their farm, a boy recognized under comic shop sludge. The men on the news say climate change is a hoax. I talk back, hold the objects they inhabit, break them. Thank you.
Wow, I just want to say thank you so much, Alexandra, for that incredible performance. Yeah, it was just, thank you. Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Serena. I'm a programming assistant at the Black House, and I will also be the moderator for the conversation we'll be having this evening. I'd like to welcome you all again to the space, and thank you so much for joining us. So we're honored to be joined by 3 incredible Stanford alumni who have been engaged in transformative work in their respective communities. And while at Stanford, we're also involved in the centers. So before we hear from them, I'd like to briefly introduce our Changemakers. So first we have Bacardi Jackson, she, her, class of 1992, who is the interim deputy legal director of the Southern Poverty Law Center's Children's Rights Practice Group. She oversees work dedicated to protecting children by stopping the school-to-prison pipeline and ensuring equitable access to mental health services and high-quality public education. Jackson has been recognized as a Florida super lawyer from 2020 through 2023, and she was also honored by Legacy Magazine in 2015 as one of South Florida's 25 most influential and prominent Black women in business and leadership. Stefanie Tsosie, Dine, she, her, class of 2009, is a senior attorney for the Tribal Partnerships Program at Earth Justice, a national environmental nonprofit law firm where she combines the practice of environmental law with the complex legal, cultural, and political issues unique to tribal and indigenous people in North America in order to preserve and protect the air, water, earth, and way of life of indigenous North Americans. And finally, we have Angel Fabian, MD, MNA, he, she, they pronouns, class of 1999, known in ceremonial spaces as Butterfly of Light. They are a person in recovery, an immigrant, a curanderex, two-spirit, queer, Benza, Zapotex, Chicanx, clinician, manager, administrator, and cultural bearer. Angel is also the current executive director at the Bay Area American Indian Two Spirits organization and sits on the board of Stanford Pride. They're also a founding member of the Bay Area Mexican Queer Two Spirit Collective. So Bacardi, Stefanie, and Angel, thank you so much for joining us. And I'd also like you to welcome you to the stage. Great. Okay. Yeah, so thank you all so much for joining us again. I just want to start by maybe asking you all to tell us a little bit about yourselves in your own words and your background. So where did you grow up and what did you study at Stanford and what kinds of extracurriculars and communities were you involved in while you were on campus? And so, yeah, why don't we start down the line with Bacardi and then move up towards me.
First of all, I want to say thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this program. It is a just incredible honor to be considered a change maker at Stanford University, the place that really grew me up. And so I want to just thank Dr. Connolly for the nomination and Joaquin for all of your work in putting on this program. And I want to call into this space and thank the many Black women on whose shoulders I stand and stood at Stanford. Mary Haynes, Sally Dixon, our sister Yvette Lee Bowser, who has not only given voice but vision to Black women so we can show up as our true and authentic selves. And so I just want to first acknowledge that I am here because so many people were here before me. But I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and I guess more than sort of where I grew up is how I grew up. I grew up the child of civil rights activists. My mother is a Jewish white woman. My father was from Mississippi, the grandson of a person who was enslaved. And I grew up in a very segregated Memphis in the 70s and 80s at a time where there was great racial tension. And so literally from the time I was in the womb, I grew up in a culture of fighting for civil rights and justice. So in terms of getting to Stanford, it was quite a culture shock to come out to California from a place where everything had been black and white, literally. I can remember when we used to stand up at the beginning of the school year and they'd say, all the Black kids stand up, all the white kids stand up, and if you're not one of those, pick one, right? So it was literally that kind of a place. And to come here to this really rich culture of recognizing so many differences that were really important to expanding my horizons. I came and thought I was going to be an engineer. I was a math science person in high school and went through a few engineering majors here. Started out, I think, mechanical, electrical, computer science. And I had this amazing opportunity to spend a summer in Nigeria through an intensive language program where I was studying Hausa. And it was in that program where I met school-age girls who did not have the choices and opportunities that I had. And I had grown up in abject poverty, but I had not really seen abject poverty until I got there. And what that brought home for me was I needed to use my choice, use my privilege and all of the things that were laid out for me to do and follow my passion. And so I actually came back and changed my major. I had been on a scholarship, so my scholarship administrator was not very happy about this, but I eventually graduated in political science, a complete 180. But I had just decided, I needed to look at what it was that had moved me. And all of the work that I had done on campus had been around political organizing. It was what drove me. It was the work that I did constantly when I got here. I was very active at first in SBSE, the Society of Black Scientists and Engineers, got very active in the Black Student Union. I eventually was chair of the Black Student Union. I worked as an RA in Ujamaa. I was an intern at the Committee on Black Performing Arts, eventually became choreographic director for Kuumba. So I kind of did a lot of things, and happily so. I was a mentor for a young woman through the Haas Service Center, and those were all very much life-changing experiences. And as I was completing my tenure, when I switched to political science, I had to do a couple extra quarters. That was when Rodney King happened. And then we had just an amazing amount of organizing, and that was probably the greatest education I could have gotten at Stanford. It was just an immediate response and reaction where we created institutions. We developed a think tank. We opened a library. We tried to stop the closing of a high school. We just organized in every way you could imagine, and it was one of the greatest moments of education of my life in terms of, one, being surprised at the level of engagement that I had lamented had not existed for so long at Stanford. But that was a really amazing way to end my time at this school. So, thank you.
Yeah, okay. I would like to echo the thanks to the organizers, to everyone who's in attendance, for welcoming me into this space, into the Native American Community Center, and Karen for nominating me as well. It's quite an honor to be here, and I get a lot of fulfillment from being able to share my experience and listening to your experiences as well. So I look forward to talking with you all afterwards as well. It's just something I like to do. But as far as where I'm from, I'm Navajo Dene. My family is from the Navajo Reservation on the New Mexico side. Navajo Reservation is a massive area. But I grew up mostly in Albuquerque and kind of going back and forth. So my grandfather had a ranch south of Gallup, and we had sheep and cattle and horses and goats, and I had a lot of cousins and family out there. And but my parents had moved to Albuquerque, and I just remember every weekend going from Albuquerque to the ranch, and then every summer going from Albuquerque to the ranch and back and forth. And so where I come from, for me, is not just one place. I spent a lot of time translating. I spent a lot of time code switching between the family that I had on the reservation and the community there, and the private school that I went to in Albuquerque. It was very drastic, just back and forth. And so coming to Stanford for me was a reach. I didn't expect to land a space here, but I'm so glad that I did, and that I came here and met so many wonderful people. When I talk about Stanford and reflect on my time here, my reflection is always about community, and not necessarily the classes that I took or what I did. Like I could tell you very little about my academic pursuits here, but it was the community that I met here. My best friends are Stanford grads, and I see them a couple times a year, and the connections were invaluable. When I was at Stanford, I was a big part of the Stanford American Indian Organization, SAIO. I served as the co-chair for Stanford Powwow for 2 years, my junior and my senior year. And I was also on staff at Muwekma for 1 year, I believe. These things are starting to blend together in my head. And I majored in Native American Studies and sociology. And so I had started out my career at Stanford not knowing what I was going to do, and my mom wanted me to be a doctor. She still wants me to be a doctor. Like, if I'm honest, she still was like, you can be a doctor. I was not. I took a year of hum bio and had never worked so hard for a bad grade in my life, and switched. So I went to sociology and Native American Studies. I had received some institutional support to do research in New Orleans after Katrina. And so I had gone down there to work with some day laborers for quite some time, summer after summer, and so that was an experience that showed me that I can kind of make up research paths for myself, and empowered me to have these experiences that I might not otherwise have had, and got me, I spent a lot of my time at Stanford within the Native community, so it got me into other community spaces that I really appreciated, that ability to translate, which ended up being a big part of my career now. I consider myself, as a lawyer, I consider myself a translator, like going back between indigenous communities and the courts. And so I have, both a family that raised me, the culture that raised me, and sort of the understanding of growing up as a person respectful of the land, as well as, coming into a community like the Native community at Stanford that was so supportive, and when I think back about all my Native friends at Stanford that I made, like, we came from all over the place, from all these different corners of the country, from different levels, different reservations or different urban areas, but we all came together and we stuck together and we stayed together, and we come back every year for powwow almost. It's a really tight-knit community, and I'm very grateful for that.
With the permission of your hearts and your permission of your minds, with the permission of the ancestors of this land who are living, and advocating for land back, and with the permission of my ancestors, Benza people of the clouds from Oaxaca. My ceremonial name is Tlawis Papalot, and I was asked to name it because there's really no phonetic translation. It's in Nahuatl, which is ancient Mexicane language. So I grew up, and my story is an immigrant story. My parents are from Yalalag, which translates into the aparted mountain, mountain community, and migrated very young to Mexico City, or Tenochtitlan, as some of us know it. And there's where I was born. In northern part of Mexico City, sometimes I tell people I come from a small village of 26 million people. Well, it wasn't that crowded back then. We were still part of the incorporated area, and there was a lot of extreme poverty, you might say. I still remember that we did not have running water. We didn't, there was a lot of need. And there was a lot of challenges, within my family structure, that eventually my mom decided to leave a very abusive relationship and go to and pave ways for herself and her smaller children. And so she migrated by herself with other women. I come from very strong matriarchs, to the US and landed in the migrant labor camps of the Central Valley. And when she was ready and when she had saved up enough, she brought us over. I'm the youngest of 5, and the 3 youngest were the ones that were brought over with her. We came from extreme poverty to another form of extreme poverty. The migrant labor camps are that. They're migrant labor camps. And our closest neighbors were, very far away. when I was, so I had been exposed to Stanford before because I've always been a nerd, and my books have always been a place of survival for me. And I did very well because that's one thing I could control, because there were so many things around me that I could not. And when I came to, I would come to summer camps, nerd camps here at Stanford. Right after, my freshman year, junior, all of those summers, I was here on campus. So I had gotten exposed to, this beauty. Although, I also got exposed to some of the apathy of this campus, because, early on in some of those camps, I was told, don't get too political. Definitely don't join Mecha. If you get to come to Stanford University. I ended up having two choices. At the same time that I was trying to choose colleges, was the last time my mom and I were homeless. And so it was between going to Harvard and coming to Stanford. So I did not want to leave my mom, because Harvard is 5 hours away by flight, and Stanford was 3 hours away by car. So I came to Stanford, and I had gotten my political education in high school with this homeboy from the mission turned migrant education counselor who instilled a lot of pride in us. And so when I came to Stanford, I knew that this place was going to, either break me or I was going to do really well, because I had the nerd skills, and I used those nerd skills until Rodney King happened. And once Rodney King happened, my freshman year, then, my political self came to be. And I was involved in Mecha, I was involved in Che. I came out to myself. I was going to the Q Center to educate myself around my sexuality, because I was uncovering my sexuality at that point as well. I'm a human biology major. The reason I stayed in human biology was because I'm a nerd. And the second was because I could create my own major, so I ended up doing, my area of concentration was the impact of HIV and AIDS in Latinx communities. And so I took radical women's, writings from Cherry Moraga. I went down to Mexico, I did, I created, they said, create your major. So I created my own major. I was also grateful to be part of a group of queers of color that were trying to create space for both of our identities. So I was part of one of the founding members of Mi Vida Loca Collective, which later became La Familia de Stanford. At the same time that was happening, queers and black Q was also being created. Queers in Nation was being created. So there was a lot of movement that was happening around multiple identities, and that we could not choose one or the other, and there had to be space for both. So I'll stop there.
Thank you all for those really wonderful and just very rich answers as well. I was curious if, now that we kind of know a little bit about your background, if you guys could tell us about the work that you do and kind of the path that you took to get there, especially post grad. And you kind of touched on this to a certain extent, but how did you kind of identify the work that you were passionate about pursuing, and also the kind of specific career? Maybe we can start again with.
Sure. So for me, it was not a very clear path. As I mentioned, I thought I was going to be engineering and ended up with a political science degree, and then was kind of like, well, what do I do with that? And so when I left Stanford, I applied for 2 fellowships. Thankfully, I got a fellowship. And but it was going to be a while before I started it, so I just moved to DC. I'd always wanted to kind of work on the Hill. I moved to DC, very naive with my resume, thinking I could walk in congressional people's offices and get a job that way. And lo and behold, I got a job, an unpaid internship, and ended up working for Congressman John Conyers. And he sent me off to do lobbying work for reparations. So I literally got laughed out of many offices as we were arguing about why reparations was even something that could be possibly viable. After that, I ended up trading in my free job for one that paid like $1,000 for a senator from Tennessee, because I figured out then you call people you know and you get jobs that way. And I ended up being the sort of press intern. And I started, after that, my fellowship in New York. I was a New York City Urban Fellow. And we had to interview with lots and lots of the departments to figure out where we would end up and who would hire us. And so it was a great experience of just interviewing a lot, getting a lot of rejections. And I think they were told to be really harsh on us so we could understand this process. I eventually interned for the Department of Corrections. And that had been really an important place for me. I grew up with an incarcerated stepfather, so I had a lot of personal experience and trauma around being a young girl going into prison environments and understanding how dehumanizing it was, how awful it is that we put people in cages and then we don't think about them again. And so it was quite an eye-opening experience. I worked Rikers Island, if you don't know, is at that time had about 20,000 people living there at any given day. It was its own city unto itself. They actually farmed their own food and had all of these different facilities, the most violent one being the juvenile facility. It was horrible. Anytime I would visit the island, I would have to just come back and decompress and walk around New York for an hour or two just to get my head back. And so that experience was really shaping for me. I knew it was important to do justice work, although I had always known that was important given my background. But following that fellowship, I ended up getting a summer internship at this organization called CASES, which was a career in alternative sentencing and employment services in the Manhattan criminal courts. And we would be tasked with going to find people who were in the holding cells behind the courthouse, who could be clients of ours, who could come into our program, which was an alternative sentencing program, so they wouldn't have to go to jail. And so we would go and interview people and then find the people who met the criteria and come back and argue in front of the court. It was at that point where I ran into these lawyers who were supposed to be representing them, who oftentimes didn't know anything about them, not even their names, and would just exhibit an amount of callousness that I couldn't even imagine. And that was the point where I decided I would go to law school. I was just so disgusted by how poorly people were represented, and I figured I could do better for folks. So I went back home to Memphis and I worked for a year at the National Civil Rights Museum. It was a huge voting rights year, did this big national program. At that time, I think Jesse Jackson and Alan Keyes were running for president. We had both of them on my panel, so it was quite an interesting time. And then I ran a youth program that summer for about 50 young people between the ages of 11 and 17, which was also quite an education. I spent most of the time pulling them out of nooks and crannies in the museum. But it was just an amazing way to start and think about the legal work that I wanted to do. I ended up going to Yale Law School and spent my first summer interning at a public defender's office because I thought that's probably the kind of work I wanted to do, and was really shocked by how much I felt in that job, how complicit the public defender's office was in the system. And I did not want to continue and be complicit in that system. The next summer, I split between a firm and the Southern Poverty Law Center and was just blown away by the work. We did some work for folks who were on death row, looking at the prison conditions, which if you've ever been in the deep, deep southern parts of Alabama, you feel like you walked into a time warp 20, 30 years before. And it was like that. It was really just depressing. You would walk into a courthouse and you would see a whole string of black men in orange jumpsuits, shackled legs and arms. Very, very moving. One of my, probably the most memorable people I met was a man on death row who explained why he was happy to be on death row. Could not imagine being a lifer in a place like that. And so that was, very, very shaping for me. But the other thing about public interest work is it's a privilege to do it, and it's also not something everybody has access to do. So when I came out of law school, I actually had the reality of my life and the family that depended on me. My sister had young sons. I had just felt like responsibility. So I ended up going into private practice to handle those responsibilities. And that is, one of the things, if you are able to support people or if you are able to go into public interest work, it is really a gift. And so I ended up staying in private practice for about 20 years. I started off at two big international law firms, one in Atlanta, which I used to affectionately call the Klan's Den. It was really quite blatantly racist. There had never been a single black attorney who had become a partner who had grown up in that firm. There were only 3 women who had become partners, all before they had children. Literally every woman who had children was told to go to the mommy track, is what they called it, which was to become a counselor. It was just everything you could imagine for a Southern white shoe law firm. The racism was palpable. I was a troublemaker. And it was there where I started out doing corporate law because I didn't think I could stomach doing litigation for a big firm. And it was quite an education because I had never known anybody who had done corporate work or business work really in that kind of way. So I learned a lot doing it, but it wasn't what I loved doing. And at one point, I was going to leave the firm, and one of my mentors said, "Why don't you come to labor and employment?" I was like, "Oh, great, that's exactly what I want to do for a big firm, is go work against the little guy for Coca-Cola." And so, so he said, "Well, trust me," he says, "most of the cases you see don't have a lot of merit, and if they do, you're in a position to do something about it." And I said, "Okay, I'm going to trust you, Sam." And I went over, and he was absolutely right. The other thing about labor and employment law is the Jerry Springer of law. I'm dating myself because y'all probably don't even know who Jerry Springer is. But it was quite interesting and fascinating and fun. And the truth is there were a lot of really bad cases. The sad news about civil rights law in the private sector is that a lot of people in the plaintiffs' bar are just making money. And as a result, you make really bad law. You bring bad cases, and judges grow callous to them. And so the people who have real problems and real issues can't get justice because the bar is so high. And so in any event, I did that work for a while, ended up moving to Philadelphia, and so I joined another huge international firm, a much more palatable place, but still the same insidious underlying racism, the barriers to growth and expansion. And I had developed a real sense when I was at King & Spalding. I was a troublemaker, as I said, and I'd organized all the black attorneys to get together, make sure we were helping each other to just survive there, but also was doing things like boycotting the annual Christmas party that was held at the golf club that had only admitted black and Jewish people in the last 5 years because they were sued. So, interestingly, when I left, they gave me the biggest party. It was elegant, it was lovely. So anyway, I found, I was at Morgan Lewis, and then in my first 6 months there, I met a guy at one of these places, and I had this real burning desire to see a Black law firm. I wanted to see us compete at that level. And he walks up to me, he says, we started chatting, he's like, you should come work for me. I'll pay you half as much and you'll work twice as hard, but we're gonna have a lot of fun. I was like, well, let me think about that for a while. So about 6 months later, I called him up and said, hey, I'm ready. And I joined his firm where I was for 13 years, and he was absolutely right. It was a lot of fun. I learned to be a trial lawyer. It was amazing to walk into the courtroom and to be constantly underestimated because we were a Black law firm. And to just whoop the other side. And part of it was because we had an experience the other attorneys didn't. We connected with jurors, we connected with witnesses in ways they could not. And so it was just an amazing place to really grow my trial lawyer wings. In all of the places I had been, I continued to do pro bono work. I always was very engaged and active in the community. I didn't know any other way to be. It was just part of the fabric of who I am. And so once I actually ended up opening our office in Florida. We had a major client who wanted us to open there, and so I opened our office when I moved to Florida for family. And it was, some years later, in the middle of some other personal things that were going on in my life, I kind of was surprised to see a job opening for Southern Poverty Law Center in Miami. And I was like, what is this place doing in Miami? When I had been at the Southern Poverty Law Center interning, there were like 5 attorneys. We would meet in the library every evening and talk about what to do next, right? And at this point, this organization had grown to over 300 people, and it was in 5 states. And so it was just surprising for it to just show up on my radar. And just at a time when I was ready to kind of get back to that work. And so I called up some of the people I used to work with, and I ended up talking to 13 more people, and then they hired me. And so that was in 2018, and I have been there ever since, working on children's rights work, which is really focusing on how do we have an equitable education system, K through 12 education system. And the devastation that we are seeing right now in our school system, where people are moving to privatize education, to defund, destabilize education, to limit access, to segregate, to continue to have the divide between rich and poor. All of these things are happening in ways that are unbelievably, just feels like we have lost so much ground. We do a lot of work on school to prison pipeline, which comes in a lot of forms. It's not just the arrest of children, but it's the push out through expulsions and suspensions. In Florida, there's a phenomenon known as the Baker Act, where we subject children to involuntary psychiatric examination as young as 5 and 6 years old, where they are taken away in handcuffs, put in a police car, and sent to a receiving facility for 3 days, sometimes for months, if they are system involved and they lose their placement. It is one of the most traumatizing things you can imagine, and prevents children from ever again talking about their mental health issues, or from being a performer in school, or they worry about whether they can get careers. And we do that to the tune of 38,000 children every single year in the state of Florida. It is unbelievable. So we have seen just some incredible systemic barriers and structures that are put in place to hurt our children. Right now, in addition to doing that work, we also focus on equitable funding to fight back against the privatization movement. We recognize people have to make choices for their families, but there has to be someone fighting for public education, which is a cornerstone of our democracy. It is the system that educates most of the children in our country. In the states that I work in, which is Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and Florida, my life is hard. In those 5 states, 1 in 3 of the children in public schools is Black. 1 in 5 is below the poverty line, and more than half of them are considered low income. So we are talking about a racial and economic justice issue when we are talking about public education. And we also fight for mental health access to make sure we have the resources and that the resources that are supposed to be guaranteed under federal law are provided to our children, not in institutions somewhere away from their families and communities, but in their homes, in their schools, in their communities. And on top of all of that now, we have the culture wars where we are seeing censorship battles and book banning and things that look like McCarthyism that I never thought I would see in my lifetime. And I am in a state where people are terrified. We have a slippery slope where we are losing democracy, and we see it every single day. And so I think I've answered the question. And so I better be quiet now and let the other panelists talk. But that's the work that I do in the path to it.
I guess I will start. As I mentioned before, I grew up in part on a ranch, that my grandfather ran, and it was for subsistence. We planted corn and squash and beans, and we had cattle and sheep, and we ate those cattle and we ate those sheep, which terrified some of my high school classmates that were at I didn't know what a vegetarian was until I went to this type of school. I didn't know what organic was. This was just something that we had done in a very resource-conscious way. New Mexico's a desert, a high desert. It's very arid. And I remember the thing that we were always most scared of as kids is if we were filling up, we had to fill up these big water tanks to go take them to water the cattle or water horses. If we turned it on and left it on, it took a long time to fill up. So we'd run off and go play. But if we accidentally left it on too long and it would overflow, my grandfather was livid. It was just, so we grew up with that resource consciousness. And when I came to Stanford, I was fortunate enough, I had left this out earlier, I had also met some great alums who were Navajo and had gone back home to do environmental work. And so Ine Begay and Jihan Giran are very active in Arizona, or had been at that time, on water rights issues. And so I had connected with them and their organization at that time and was able to do some volunteer work and sort of connect to that environmental side. They were doing environmental work. And so when I left Stanford, I had a Stanford degree with Native American Studies and sociology. I had this pull towards protecting resources, acknowledging culture, and figuring out, we have scarce resources in the Southwest, and what do we do with that, these natural resources? But I didn't know what to do with all of those three things at the same time. And so after I graduated, I moved to Denver, and I worked for a nonprofit in development, which means I asked a lot of people for money. And the first development job I had didn't work out. It was the first job out of college. It's a learning experience. Excuse me. But I ended up trying to stick with development and had that job for some time until I got restructured out of the organization. There was a financial downturn, and so me and several of my colleagues were then out of a job. And so I decided to focus on something else, and I went into the public school system in Denver as an Indian education liaison. So I was working with parents, students, community members within this public school district who identified as Native. And it was a great job, but I remember a moment thinking to myself, I can do more. This is not, I like this, but I'm not the best suited for these skills, and I can do something different. And at that point, I decided to apply to grad school. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to go to grad school or if I wanted to go to law school. So I applied to everything. I took the GRE, I took the LSAT, I applied to all these schools. And I ended up, there was a moment, because I didn't get accepted everywhere, but trying to figure out, what do I want out of grad school, right? I wanted to do research. I had done research. I had received that funding from Stanford to do summer research programs. I did that for 3 summers at Stanford and did a different research program every time, and I loved it. But I didn't feel like that's where my skills were best suited. And so I ended up back in Albuquerque at the University of New Mexico School of Law, and thought, you know, if law school doesn't work out, I can go to grad school. Like I don't have to do this. But it turned out I was really good at it, and it turned out that I really loved the program I was in. So the University of New Mexico has a lot of Native faculty that teach Indian law, and not just Indian law, but Native American natural resources law, Indian water law, the economic development in Indian country. So I had so many courses that were available to me in Indian law, and I went to law school thinking, okay, well, I'm here, and I really want to go back and help my community, and so I was aiming towards an organization like the Native American Rights Fund or the National Congress of American Indians, organizations that work exclusively with tribes, or maybe working on behalf of a tribe as tribal counsel or in-house counsel. But I was still taking all these environmental law courses. I was taking not just the ones that were cross-listed with Indian law, but natural resource development. I had always had that pull of trying to understand how our environmental laws worked. And I ended up doing another dual program. So I got my certificate in Indian law and had taken most of the environmental law courses that were available there. And when I graduated, I knew, as I was looking at graduation, I knew I wanted to do both of those things at the same time, and I wasn't sure where. And I had, if you go to law school, if you're familiar with law school, it's very common to intern somewhere your first summer between, and then you go somewhere else your second summer between, and that sort of is supposed to set you up for where you're going to end up. But I had done things drastically out of my wheelhouse and on purpose, because I like experiencing other work and I like working with other communities. So my first summer, I worked at the New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty, and my second summer, I was actually at the Southern Poverty Law Center in New Orleans. And so I got to see some of the children's advocacy work that they were doing down there. When I was in New Mexico, I had studied the Affordable Care Act. That was just when it passed, and so people would say, well, have you read it? I'm like, yes, I have read 990 pages of this whole thing, so let's do this. And so as I'm looking at graduation, and I'm trying to figure out how can I do these two things together, because that space didn't really exist of the intersection of Indian law and natural resources or environmental law. And so I Googled environmental law nonprofit. Earth Justice showed up as one of them. And there was an opening in an office in Seattle, which is where I am now, for an associate attorney. And that office had done work in the past litigating on behalf of tribes. So Washington has a very large number of tribes there. And so I interviewed and was able to join that office. And over the course of a few years, I had managed to make sure that my docket consisted of only representing tribal governments. So I'd started out working on other things, but it was the beginning of my second year. The Standing Rock Sioux Tribe contacted our office because we had done pipeline work in the Pacific Northwest. And they said, hey, we have a pipeline. And we said, hey, we represent, this is exactly some of the stuff that we would litigate. So as an associate, that was the first big case that I had worked on, was representing Standing Rock in the DAPL litigation. And from there, I had worked with the Yurok tribe. The Klamath River salmon issue is something that's ongoing to this day. The timing of this event is great for me. It's 5 years ago today. I was in the federal district court in San Francisco arguing with colleagues on water for the salmon in Klamath, and we won. Unfortunately, the Yurok still has to litigate that every year. But as I was doing this work within the Seattle office, the regional office, that office is focusing not just on tribes, but on everything regional. So coal trains and export terminals, and I worked on a case against a proposed methanol plant. So there's so many different issues, but I had really wanted to work with tribal governments. And what I had also noticed is that my colleagues, while they're amazing and really well-versed in environmental law, they did not know anything or much about Indian law. And Indian law is such a niche practice. I always used to joke when I talked to law students, like, if you haven't taken an Indian law course, you have to. Just one Indian law course. Because we complicate everything in the law when it comes to how the laws are applicable to lands and peoples and environment. And so at some point, when I was working with this office, I had noticed that there was a gap, there was a need for this expertise. At this point, I'm an associate like 3 years out of law school, but I was the one that was answering these questions, and that didn't seem right to me. So I wrote a proposal and took it to the board, took it to strategic planning to create a tribal partnerships program. And they did. And so now that's where I am. I've created, people ask, how did you get the job that you have? And I made it up. And it's great. We now have a team. We have a managing attorney who just moved from Denver to DC. And she came with a wealth of experience. We have an attorney in Tucson. We have an associate attorney in Chicago. We have a litigation assistant in Denver. And our program is all over the country. We represent tribes all over the country against extractive industries, or to protect cultural resources, or those two are often tied together. And I'm really hoping that this grows. And I went from a job where I was litigating in either state or federal court 90% of the time to now I litigate, I would say 50 to 60% of the time, and the rest is doing outreach. So we're re-examining how can we as attorneys best serve communities. And it's not always in the courtroom, right? The courtroom's the last place you want to be, really. Like if you're in the courtroom, it's because everything has gone wrong. And so, we're trying to work with communities earlier on in the process. Unfortunately, a lot of my job responsibilities change at political whims. So during the last administration, I was playing whack-a-mole on stopping things and stopping regulations, and now we're playing whack-a-mole on tribal consultation policies and things that are coming at a rapid pace, but from a different direction. And I'm still based in Seattle, but like I said, I work all across the country. Right now, most of my clients are in the Midwest. One of the cases I'm working on now is on the Line 5 pipeline on behalf of the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. And the most recent case that kind of closed, but that I'm keeping an eye out, is on a Back 40 mine, which is an open pit heavy metals mine on behalf of the Menominee Indian Tribe of Wisconsin. So it's two big things. More stuff is coming, I'm sure. Unfortunately, I suspect I will have a job doing this work for a very long time, but I'm hoping to, one day work myself out of a job, and we have, great permitting structures and have decreased our reliance on extractive practices against indigenous peoples. So.
How much time we got?
That's a good question.
So my path around health and wellness has not been linear. Just like my path in academics has not been linear. It took me 8 years to graduate from Stanford. It took me 7 years to finish my master's. And I think the only one that I went straight through was my 4 years to do my MD. And this just happened recently, 5 years ago. So my junior year at Stanford, I had a close call with HIV. And it was the early 90s. The second wave of AIDS was happening that was impacting queer, gay, and bisexual men of color, specifically. And the queer women in the community were taking care of us. This was prior to medication, to ART, which came around in '96. So I started doing HIV work. Fortunately, I tested negative, but I couldn't focus my junior year, so I took a leave of absence my junior year to work at 2 health departments. I worked at the San Mateo County AIDS program and in the San Francisco AIDS program. at that time, because there was very few of us doing the work, who had cultural knowledge, who had language knowledge, who could get in and out of community the way that very few of us could. We were doing community organizing. We were doing food distribution. We were doing funeral arrangements. We were doing case management. We were doing everything because there was not a lot of us doing the work. I ended up living in East Palo Alto, and East Palo Alto had just faced a really intense crack epidemic, and now it had turned into an AIDS epidemic. And so there was my colleagues who were doing work with the intravenous drug using community. We're feeling the just the amount of grief and the amount of death that comes around with working in community, in such a small community, and so much death so quickly. I, gave a lot of HIV positive test results. I also buried a lot of folks. And I think there was a point where my youngest volunteer, little brother, Miguelito, he was diagnosed at 17 with indigenous from Michoacan. He was diagnosed at 17 with a slew of STIs and also full-blown AIDS. At 21, he passed away with a really bad case of toxoplasmosis. That one hurt. And after I finished arranging all the services to send him down to Mexico, I began my journey back to Stanford. Also, I had, Dean Montoya, who I don't know if some of you remember Dean Montoya, but very open about his sexuality and very, it was very important for him to find me because he knew my mom as well. And him and my mom tag teamed me and said, you need to come back and finish up. And, I left in good academic standing because I'm a nerd. And so I knew I was going to come back and finish up. That was not the issue. It was just, how could I pull myself away from community and the community work that I was doing to be able to have a greater reach. So for those of you who are thinking of taking a break, if you need it, take it. Because this place can be really intense as well. And remember, come back. Because we need you, communities need you with that piece of paper. And mind you, the communities that I got the privilege to work in don't really care about that piece of paper. They care whether or not you can do the work. Because don't waste their time if you can't. But in other spaces, that Stanford degree is gonna open a lot of doors and a lot of opportunities for not only yourself, but for also community that you are trying to advocate for. I have worked in a slew of places, a lot of community health centers, a lot around sexual health, around HIV and AIDS. I have been a program officer, meaning that I get to give money away. I kind of like that one. I didn't like the agency, but I liked, giving folks money to do the work that they needed to do. And I've done, because of all the years of experience around doing HIV work and doing some national organizing work with around LGBT movements, I was able to, my second to the last job, I think, was with Impact, which was, it's a global health organization doing advocacy work for LGBT communities, mostly in the global south. And we got to do a lot of capacity building and training with activists that are doing on-the-ground work and are really doing some, there's some really, the US and the global north export really regressive policies and regressive ways of thinking that are true to a lot of the places that honored and respected Two-Spirit folks, LGBT folks, queer folks. And so a lot of communities in Africa and Asia, in Central and South America are having to do some really strong advocacy to just find humanity. Right now, I'm keeping a close eye on Uganda. Uganda's about to pass a law that criminalizes being homosexual. Mm-hmm. Again. I had been approached many times throughout the years to become an executive director of different organizations. And I think it was about timing and fit. My personal journey around recovery, because that's part of my story and part of my family's story. I'm the first person to get sober in my family. I don't know, hopefully I will not be the last. But my journey in sobriety for the last 18 years has definitely impacted my healing journey. I was talking to another student earlier today, and I was letting them know that we cannot heal when we're broken. Something that I learned from one of my maestras, one of my teachers, one of my spiritual teachers, is that if you have a cold or a flu, you can't be spiritual. You have to rest. You have to get better. You have to, you can't. You can't do the healing work if you're not well. And so whatever that means for you, or whatever, what it meant for me is that I really needed to do some deep, deep work. And it was tied to my spirituality, and it was tied to my indigeneity, as someone from Latin America, and lo and behold, Bates has been around. Bates is the Bay Area American Indian Two-Spirit Society. I didn't understand the magnitude of the organization until last February. And I'll share that in a little bit. So the organization has been around for 23 years and has been run mostly by volunteers who have found home, unfortunately, and solace in creating community. Because, unfortunately, colonization has done a number on a lot of indigenous community, pushing their Two-Spirit relatives aside or away. Mind you, the Indian Relocation Act, also impacted it, specifically in the Bay Area. But this amazing group of volunteers have been creating spaces, have been creating beauty in ceremony and cultural and artistic venues for Two-Spirit folks to flourish. They have a Two-Spirit drum that some drums are traditionally only male presenting. This is mostly female presenting. Awesome. We also have, we just had our 12th annual Two-Spirit powwow, where 4,000 of our closest relatives showed up from throughout Indian country, including Central and South America and Canada. We had 200 and plus dancers. We had 60 vendors. It was massive, in San Francisco. If you're ever here in February, come to the Bates Powwow. It's the destination spot. And I get to apply everything that I've learned along the way to take something that's been working and take it to the next level. That's all. You know, what I learned in the community organizing that I do, in the community organizing work, was that a good community organizer doesn't stay in the organization forever. A good community organizing is able to organize the community, take themselves out, and the community continues to work. So I've taken that to heart. And yeah, and whether or not I'm going to practice medicine, the medicine piece, I always wanted to, you know, I took the MCATs 3 times. Twice I got, the first 2 times that I took the MCATs, I got secondaries. I was just not ready. You know, I was just not ready to do the healing work. And I had to do it for a different reason, because I'm not, you know, hopefully as you can tell, I'm not in it for the money or the fame or the glory, because I would be working up in a community clinic in my ideal, you know, MD job. I do it because it's necessary. It's needed. You know, wherever your career goals or path takes you, we need you there. Point blank. We just need you there, because there's not enough of us. You know, there's not enough, not change makers, troublemakers. You know, I was part of Stanford, a group of Stanford students, I think my freshman year, that we put together the disorientation guide. Because there was a lot of orientation guides, we had to create a disorientation guide for folks to be able to survive this place. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, thank you so much for everything that you guys have shared. It's remarkable how, with only 2 questions, I feel like you have imparted so much wisdom and also like answered the vast majority of questions I was going to ask. But yeah, maybe for the sake of time, if each of you could very quickly, maybe to kind of close out, share one thing that you think like students in the audience, like a lesson or a piece of advice for students who are interested in doing this kind of like really important like troublemaking or change-making work, to carry with them to the future really quickly, and then we'll move to the closing part, yeah. And we can start with you, Angel.
I think I said it. You know, we need you. We need you. Whatever your gift, whatever your magic, whatever your passion is, we need it. We desperately need it. I can tell you right now that I am getting prepared for the mass exodus that is going to happen of trans, queer folks from repressive states. I'm getting ready because they will be coming to the Bay Area, and the Bay Area is not affordable. So I am trying to find the resources to make sure that I can house people, that I can feed people, that I can make sure that they are that they come to a safe haven. You know, so I need allies. You know, I need fellow troublemakers that are going to be able to stand a good fight. You know, so keep doing what you're doing, and but do take care of yourself, because this is not this journey called life is not easy, and for some of us it hasn't been easy, but you know it's well worth it, and I'm grateful to be here. You know, I for a while I would say that I don't think I'm going to make it past 30. I just turned 50. And she looks lovely.
That's fantastic. I think if there's one piece of advice that I I mean, piece that I took from Stanford and something that I've consistently used is you can make it up. Like if it doesn't exist, you can make it up. And I did that at Stanford. I made up research opportunities and got funding for it. I made my job. I made my program. And I especially in the law, I always tell people like the law is not written for communities of color. The law is not written to protect people. In environmental law, especially, like it's written to tell people how to pollute and how to be extractive and be destructive. But we can. Part of my job as a lawyer is I make stuff up. I made up this whole petition process, and now it's year 3 that people ask, well, has this been done before? And it has not. Like again, we made it up. The Army Corps, like we've never done this before. So, and that's something that I do. Seemingly more often as spaces start to fit less of what we need, especially as climate change and the laws that we have aren't catching up with climate change and the things that people need. Just you can make it up. So I'm glad to be here and with Troublemakers and hopefully continue to just make stuff up as I keep going.
I kind of feel like I'm full circle here. When I was at Stanford, I took a class from Professor Clay Carson about the life. It was a comparison class between King and Malcolm X, and I just did all the reading I could for those 2 troublemakers. And my favorite quote has been since that time out of the letter King wrote from a Birmingham jail. And it is that human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. Human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It takes tireless work. It takes persistent effort. We have to be co-creators with God. Those were his words. And I actually think, he was standing in a space where he was fighting for things we never had before. He was in a moment in history where we had to chart new ground. And here we are where, being invited to be acknowledged as a change maker feels a little fraudulent to me, I have to say, because I feel like we haven't honored the legacy. We haven't honored the change that was made, and we've lost it. And I think if King was here today, he'd probably finish that quote and say, it is not enough to have human progress. It's not enough to change. We have to hold on to it. We can't assume that the battle is won because we won some victory. We win a case or we win one community thing. The other side is standing there never giving up and having a long game. And we have got to step into this space with a long game, a long-term vision about the world we expect our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren to inherit, because they will look back at us and say, what did you do? You have handed us the exact same thing, or worse than what you were handed. And so, as I'm sitting here in the realities of segregated schools, of censorship, of forced genital examinations for children to play sports, of just the most horrific things that you could think of people doing to each other and to children, I know it is not enough for us to just bring forward change. We have got to change hearts and minds, and we've got to have a vision, and we've got to pass it on to the next generation that you've got to make this last. And so we will constantly be here doing our part. This room is not jam-packed as it should be, but the truth is it's only always been a handful of people. And so no matter what the room looks like, no matter how many people come or don't come, we need, as you said, Angel, we need everybody who's willing to have that vision. It took 4 students to chart a movement. It took a DJ in Birmingham. It just takes a vision and some effort, and then we've got to hold on. So with that, I'll just say, hold on.
Sarah. Okay, thank you all so much for sharing and for this wonderful conversation. So I think to close out the event, we're going to have Sarah, one of the other student organizers.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for your engagement tonight for Changemakers 2023. You have all been so thoughtful and truly powerful speakers, and we have learned so much from your experiences. You have expressed an outpouring of love and care for the community, and we cannot thank you enough for the change that you have created and continue to inspire in us. On behalf of the centers, we have a surprise for you. As recognition of the change you have created, the communities you serve, and thanking you all for coming back to Stanford to speak to us, we would like to present you with awards. On behalf of the Centers for Equity, Community, and Leadership, we would like to present Bacardi Jackson 92 with the Changemakers Award. May I have a representative from the Black Community Services Center come to the podium?
So I'm presenting this on behalf of the BCSC. It's a token of our appreciation. It's a swag bag. Thank you so much for for coming. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. And again, on behalf of the Centers for Equity, Community, and Leadership, we would like to present Stefanie Tsosie, 09, with the Changemakers Award. May I have a representative from the Native American Cultural Center come to the podium?
Good evening, everyone. There's a favorite quote I share from the Apache Nation, which translates to, "Wisdom sits in places." And I'm honored to be in space and place with these changemakers, troublemakers tonight. And one of our traditions in the Native community is to bestow on honored guests, marking time, space, and wisdom, a blanket. So first, Stefanie. We'd also like to honor our other colleagues as well.
Thank you. On behalf of the Centers for Equity, Community, and Leadership, we would like to present Angel Fabian, 99, with the Changemakers Award. And may I have a representative from QSR, Queer Student Resources, come to the podium?
Hello, everyone. Thank you again for attending Changemakers. My name is Joaquin Garcia Peraza. I'm the project coordinator for the Centers for Equity, Community, and Leadership. I would just like to thank, first of all, give a round of thanks to Yvette Lee Bowser. Without her donation, this series wouldn't be possible. I would also like to thank Jan Barker Alexander for inventing the series and giving light to such a beautiful pathway for us to share space together. I would also like to thank the crew for Stanford Video and Audio Event Services. Thank you so much for being here. Yes. And I would like to thank everyone from the Centers for Equity, Community, and Leadership, all the directors and all the student staff who just work so hard every day to create community for those in Stanford already and creating a safe space for students. And last but not least, I would like to thank the 3 Changemaker coordinators that were students that worked on this. First off, Viv. Next off, our wonderful moderator, Serena. And last but not least, Sarah. And last but not least, I would like to thank Faith for her wonderful guidance throughout this entire process. This wouldn't have been done without you, so thank you so much. And again, thank you so much for attending Changemakers 2023. I hope you have a lovely evening. Last but not least, on the side are pictures of the Changemakers with mouths around them. If you have like a special message to write to them, something that really stuck with you tonight, or anything you want to say to them, that's just a direct message, and they're all going to be given to the Changemakers after as a little token of appreciation for being here tonight. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night.